This is the official timeline for the oldest sword fighting game on Roblox, spanning nearly 2 decades from 2007 to 2026. But this isn't just any ordinary game. It's a story of decades of history through its rise, its fall, and its rebirth. How does a game survive 19 years through 4 different communities and still refuse to die? To understand that, we have to go back to where it all began. Sword Fight in the Heights Original goes live for the very first time on April 11th, 2007 by Telemon. In its early release, the game averaged 10 to 50 players by 2007 in its beta version. A completely new genre is born, the first true sword-only combat experience on Roblox. Almost instantly, it becomes a battleground for skill, precision, and dominance, a place where legends are forged and when countless names rise over the years, only to be forgotten by time. This wasn't just any ordinary game. This was the birth of a community, a culture, a legacy. So now let's begin with the community. The owner of the game, Telemon, who goes by Shedletsky now, who was an employee for Roblox and was one of the most famous devs on the game who helped establish what the game is today. Telemon was a rare and exceptional dev who used to spend a lot of time in the community, playing his own games and spending his time with its early Roblox players. In its early days, however, if you had a request or had constructive criticism, he would fix it or take it very seriously, as he wanted Roblox to be fair and good as possible. His name also gathered a lot of attention on his games, and Sword Fight in the Heights Original instantly becomes a hit. Now, you may ask, why did the game become an instant hit? Players gravitated towards its simplicity and basic mechanics. Telemon would often play with the community. It became one of the most favorable games. It was like Jailbreak of the modern day. By March 12, 2008, Sword Fight in the Heights Original had become one of the best games on Roblox, with 150 to 300 plus players by mid-late 2008. Servers would be buggy. It would allow some servers to hit 15 plus players in one server, sometimes 20 or more. The original community of Roblox was very calm, however. The internet was still a new thing, so players were more friendly than they are now. The biggest aspect of Sword Fight in the Heights Original was the community itself. It was very tight, and everybody knew each other, as this was evidently clear, as players could remember each other even after 2 decades have passed. And the community progressed. Sword fighting became one of the most famous genres side by side with brick battling, where other players such as Ronaldinho 2 and Ambusher 11 would main brick battling. But eventually, sword fighting had become so competitive and taken to a new level. But now, sword fighting groups and clans are a very prominent aspect in the competitive sword fighting scene. Like, even when I first started in 2013 to 2014, you'd have your inbox full of invitations to clans. But back in the day, you'd have to try out for certain groups to be qualified, and players would garner reputations within these affiliated groups. 2 very famous groups in the sword fighting community back in the day, and still mentioned today, were TKO, created by Sicko, and the Sword Union, created by Linker Connected. These 2 groups were some of the most respected groups of the day, and many more would follow, such as the Neon Sword Fighting Group in 2012 to 2014, where multiple players would have Neon in their name and would play Sword Fighting Heights original all the time. But now, let me take you through the first era players, the ones that started it all and left a legacy to go claim. These were the players who started it all. 50 of preserved players that would play every day on the oldest sword fighting game. 50 childhoods, 50 stories, one legacy. The pioneers of Sword Fighting Heights original, the very first generation to step into one of Roblox's oldest sword fighting games. There was no established communities, no famous clans, no competitive scenes, just a handful of players discovering a game that would quietly grow into something far greater than anyone could have imagined. Every duel, every rivalry, every friendship began with them. They unknowingly laid the foundation for a community that would last for 2 decades. Many of these players have long since disappeared. Some left Roblox years ago, others simply faded into history, but a lot of them are password guessed. But however, this era followed would never have existed without them. Their stories may no longer be told, but their legacy lives on through every player who picked up a sword after them. These were the first legends of Sword Fighting Heights original. Throughout the game's decades of history, the old ways of this era were chill, unlike the online behaviours that are accepted now, such as doxing, leaking, and bullying. These behaviours were completely shunned in this era of sword fighting. For example, if you were an online dater, you were shunned out of the community. If you were toxic, you were clowned by the community. The Sword Fighting Heights original community was regarded as one of the most mature communities in the sense that degeneracy was frowned upon and respect was the bare minimum. But in saying this, the first generational players would begin to experience the first wave of exploiters. As the community would say, Sword Fighting Heights original was the birthplace of exploiters, even 20 years later. At the time, one of the earliest exploits used in Sword Fighting Heights original was a program known as Cheat Engine. It allowed players to manipulate the game using simple script commands, making it one of the very first forms of cheating seen during the game's early years. Many players would complain and say hacks and he or she is hacking, as later on throughout the years, legendary conspiracies would circle around Roblox, such as the infamous 1x1x1x1x and the John and Jane Doe. This would outrage players. The player base would complain left, right, and center as their favorite game was being ravaged by exploiters. It was not until Telemon himself would consistently up the game to block certain script commands, and this is what kept the exploiting regulated. But this also enabled exploiters to make new scripts and commands to bypass the new coding that Telemon would instill in the game and Roblox in general. And it was balanced, as its early exploiters couldn't take over the game for now, which now takes us to the golden era, Shift Lock Revolution. In 2011, sword fighting changed forever. A new feature known as Shift Lock was introduced to Roblox, and overnight, combat was completely revolutionized. Movement became faster, more aggressive, more unpredictable. The old style of sword fighting that players had spent years mastering suddenly began to disappear. Veteran players rejected the change immediately. Some adapted, many quit entirely. But to understand why the Shift Lock revolution caused such chaos, we first need to understand the difference between classicing and moonwalking. Before 2011, one legendary player dominated the first era of sword fighting. His name was Milkman, one of the earliest players to ever step foot on the oldest sword fighting game on Roblox, and the first player in history to achieve an unbelievable 100,000 KOs. Milkman mastered a technique known as classicing, a slower, calculated fighting style built around baiting, movement, prediction, spacing, and timing.
As seen in this footage, his combat style relied heavily on patience and positioning, long before shift lock ever existed. This was the foundation of sword fighting before 2011. The style an entire generation of players had grown up mastering, but everything was about to change. A player by the name of Bunza800, seen throughout many early clips, eventually mastered the art of moonwalking on the oldest sword fighting game on Roblox, by performing the iconic 360 Bunza spin across the heights. Bunza800 became one of the most recognizable sword fighters of the era, known for practicing endlessly on Sword Fight on the Heights original, and dueling players like Linker Connected, who was another top competitor of its time. Bunza800 fought to prove himself as one of the greatest sword fighters on Roblox. But as we look at other players such as Ardent Luz, an IV player who practiced on original often, would also master moonwalking coupled with classicing, a deadly combo for any opponent at the time. He mastered this by studying the old ways and the new ways, and as we see in this video, he conveys mastery with the sword and unique precision for his time. One of my favorite duels of all time. This being the difference between classicing and moonwalking, or mixed together as seen in these footages. But now that we understand the old and new mechanics and the mastery behind them, let us return to the timeline and show you something far greater that players once thought was impossible on the oldest sword fighting game on Roblox. Flight. And no, not developer commands, not admin powers, not exploits, real players flying across the map. Around 2011, players experimenting with moonwalk mechanics discovered a strange glitch. If two players collided into each other at the right angle whilst moving, the physics would completely break. For veterans, this was amazing. This was weaponized and used to create massive grips on these islands, and even flying away from exploiters. Sword fighters began mastering this glitch, using moonwalk movements to control their momentum mid-air. Players would soar across the heights, flying over cliffs, castles, entire battlefields. It became one of the first legendary movement glitches in the game's history. And for many players in 2011 to 2013, seeing somebody fly across the map for the first time felt almost supernatural. But let me take you through the community of this era this time. The legends, the kings, the forgotten veterans that played in the golden age. As someone who has joined in this era, I can not only show you the already known sword fighters, but rather I am here to represent the forgotten ones, the regular veterans that were overshadowed by its larger competition. But now, what if I told you during this era of 2011 to 2013 that such a simple game, like the oldest sword fighting game on Roblox, had its own kings? Yes, you might ask, how can such a simple game have its own kings? Well, Milkman from the first era was considered not only the KO king, but the king of the heights at one point during the first era. But as for the second era, one name echoed across the heights more than most, Facundo100, a legendary player who played almost every day on the oldest sword fighting game on Roblox during 2011 to 2013. Facundo100 had achieved an incredible milestone for its time, an unheard of milestone, 3,000 KOs on original. By this time, having such a large KOs in its early days in one sitting is unheard of. Hardly nobody knows about this, but the community of its time had witnessed this large feat. Old players respected him, new players feared him, and many began proclaiming him the king of original. But Facundo was more than just another skilled sword fighter who was associated in many groups. He became one of the first players to truly represent Sword Fight on the Heights original competitively, helping shape the identity of the early sword fighting community itself, which inspired new players like me for its time during 2013 to do the same thing. Even as games filled with hundreds of players during this era, names like Facundo100 became legends in this era. But now I want to acknowledge a 2011 player in this era who did so much for the community but received so much backlash. But he ultimately represented not only Sword Fight on the Heights original, but many other classical games. S'mores IV, one of the most underrated players of its time, who took a lot of backlash from other veterans. But I'm here to represent the notable legends in this community, not the already known ones, not the already popularized ones. I'm here to represent the ones that don't get the recognition. He helped establish groups, alliances, and heavily looked after Sword Fight on the Heights original during this time. He even proclaimed to have seen someone get 10,000 KOs on original, which is still unheard of to this day. As a good friend of his for many years, as we both represented the same game in different eras, let's hear Popper, another player in the first era, a 2008 player, who had a lot to say about s'mores in this now deleted podcast I did with Popper and Corbin. Let's hear it.
That I want to bring up is s'mores, bro. I never see s'mores in these Hall of Fames. Yeah, shout out s'mores, bro. I never see him in any of these Hall of Fames, and I know I keep saying his name, but it's because people are underestimating what this guy did for the community behind the scenes, bro. Big time.
And now, amongst the final respected warriors of original, we have Leetness, a player who fought during the golden era of 2011 to 2013, and heavily respected by both the old and new generation of players. Many players don't know this, but he was heavily involved in the forms before they were removed, and played a big role in representing Sword Fight on the Heights original. And years later, as the game closed in 2016, during 2020, when original still had a broken community, he would help establish the third group that attempted to revive the community and bring life back to the Heights once more, the Council of Sword Fight on the Heights. One of the last truly respected players of original, who I had a great friendship with during this time, and I'm happy to announce him as one of the honourable mentions in this timeline. But these were some of the well-known sword fighters during this era. But now, I'm going to represent the forgotten community, players that were overshadowed, but were extremely loyal to its community, the players that have been forgotten through time, but I haven't forgotten. But now, what made veterans like colourful, special, wasn't just skill, it was loyalty to its community. A veteran player by the name of Colourful joined Sword Fight on the Heights original in 2010 and was one of the very first players I had ever met as a newbie on the Heights. During the second era, he became known as one of the community's most loyal and respected veterans. All players respected him not because he was chased fame or competitive glory or was a clanner or a scrimmer, but because of the person he was. Chill, talkative, and always welcoming to its newer players on Sword Fight Nights original. Unlike many others during that era, Colourful never cared much for the mainstream competitive side of sword fighting. To him, the community itself was mattered more than being known as the best. When Sword Fight on the Heights original closed in 2016, 10 years ago, he stayed loyal to the community, alongside several other veterans who I'll name soon. He moved to fencing, calling it their new home, while still representing the spirit of original. The last time I ever spoke to him was 2018, shortly after Sword Fight on the Heights original reopened. He hoped that one day the community could rebuild itself back to the spirit of the golden era, and for the first time in years, he was happy to see a new hope for Sword Fight on the Heights original again. But just as Colourful says there's a new hope when the game reopened, many were not as fortunate as Colourful. Another veteran worth remembering is Random Cup, a notable player who had been part of the community since the first and second era of Sword Fight Nights original. A highly respected veteran who stayed loyal to the game and its community throughout its golden years. Much like Colourful, what made him respected was his loyalty, his presence, and the way he treated the community. He was talkative, welcoming, and instantly respected by old and new players alike. He witnessed much of Sword Fighting Heights Original's history during its peak years, and newer players including myself learned from veterans like him simply by being around them. We never spoke, but back in those days you didn't really need to. He deserves an honourable mention in this timeline because he remains loyal to Sword Fighting Heights Original even through its decline and eventual closure. The last time I ever saw Random Cup was nearly 10 years ago when the game shut down. He became one of many veterans who quietly walked away from the community for good. But that cannot be said for some of the female sword fighters who have been forgotten through time. Players who were heavily respected amongst the veterans of Sword Fighting Heights Original during 2011 to 2013, the Golden Era. One of them was Valerie, a highly skilled sword fighter who began playing around 2010 during the peak years of the Heights, who I even feared as a newbie. She was respected simply because she was different. She was respected because she dominated, was loyal to the community, skilled with the sword, as she mastered both moonwalking and classicing. Some even claim that she was the queen of the Heights. She was that good, and I lost many times to her when I first started. Valerie became one of the most memorable veterans who witnessed both the rise and eventual fall of Sword Fighting Heights Original. And just like veterans such as Colourful and Random Cup, she had seen it all. The golden years, the rivalries, the communities, and eventually the decline of the Heights itself in 2016. Other formidable female sword fighters during this era were Exceline and Blue H, who were just like Valerie and were well-respected veterans who were well-known within the community, yet rarely ever given the recognition they deserved. But their names still remain part of the history of the official timeline on this game. But now, many players have asked me over the years, who were the silent warriors of the Golden Era? And every time, my mind always went back to one man, not because he was my master, but because he was a silent slayer, Catsminer, a player who originally began during the first era of Sword Fighting Heights Original, and later became one of the most feared yet mysterious figures on the Heights during the first era, the second era, and even the third era. What made him so respected? Was it his skill, or was it the intimidating silence that surrounded him? Just like many of the forgotten veterans of Original, Catsminer fought alongside his brother Resurgent Tank during the Golden Era. Together, they became known as Quiet Warriors of the Heights. But what made Catsminer so different was that he never cared about recognition. Just like Colourful, just like Random Cup, he rarely spoke. Although Colourful did speak, and Random Cup did speak, Catsminer was different. He never spoke, he never chased fame, and to many players, he became known as the silent whisperer of the Heights, the mysterious figure. He would rather remain one of the forgotten warriors of Sword Fighting Heights Original than become a legend remembered by everybody, and would rather train someone like me to become a legend for his legacy back in the Golden Era. And that is exactly why he deserves a place in the official timeline of Original, because he witnessed the first era in silence, fought through the second era as a warrior, and even returned during the third era from 2020 to 2022. A man who almost never spoke unless you were part of his circle. And the deeper you look into the history of Original, the more his name continues to appear. More about him later. And now, last but not least, we have Skull129. A lot of players will be surprised he's in the timeline. Wow. A player known by almost everybody, a legend in the sword fighting community. So why have I placed him in the forgotten category? And what exactly made him so different from the others? Was he simply another veteran? Or was he one of the very few who left Original behind to pursue something far greater? Just like many of the players mentioned before him, Skull originally began on the oldest sword fighting game on Roblox during the first era, and he experienced the rise of the second era, and years later returned during the third era. Before becoming widely known across the competitive sword fighting scene, Skull was originally a veteran of Original itself. He trained hundreds of players there. And during 2012, as the competitive sword fighting began evolving to something far greater during this time, Skull slowly drifted away from Original and pursued the mainstream side of sword fighting. But unlike many players who chased recognition, Skull never truly wanted attention. He'd preferred to be forgotten, just like Cat Spider, just like Random Cup, just like Colorful. Yet players naturally looked up to him, and over time he became one of the most respected names of his generation. Even Brie Popper spoke to me years before this, saying he was a feared opponent. What made Skull truly unique, however, was his mastery of mechanics, and was quite feared. Many players would call him the Assassin. Why? Because for its time, he had a rushing hybrid style, and for 2012, that was never really seen before. Nobody would really master this. He was one of the first. And when moonwalking first appeared and completely changed sword fighting combat forever, only a handful of players were capable of mastering it alongside classicing. Skull was one of those players. At a time when most people struggled to even understand the movement, Skull had already mastered it. But despite the competitive fame, despite the recognition, Skull originally came from the heights. From Original, he was a veteran. That's where his story truly began. And when the game finally closed in 2016, just like Random Cup and many others before him, Skull disappeared from the community entirely. Years later, he eventually returned, not to Original, but made his new home fencing. And that's where I personally met him all those years ago. And this is why Skull deserves his place within the official timeline of Original, because unlike many others, Skull represented both worlds, the old generation of Original players teaching hundreds of players then, and the new generation of players in the competitive side of his return, and still teaching many. But now the golden era had finally come to an end, and what came next was the final chapter before the game's closure. A sad reality, the downfall of the old community, 2014 to 2016, the exploiting era. But now we enter 2014 to 2016. This was a sad part of the old community, a sad era, because by this time, lots of the 2008 players like the Fruit Loop and many more had retired or quit entirely. And not only that, but sword fighting was rising as a whole, with different games, other games and groups were dominating by 2014. It was getting really popular, which left a simplistic game like Sword Fighting Heights Original to die and become overshadowed by its larger competition. But the community of Sword Fighting Heights Original, my home, and many of the veterans' home was dying. By this time, the community had between 30 to 100 players, regulars, or a bit more than that between 2014 to 2016. It was still a stable community, but then something took over, completely dominated Original, and completely destroyed the game. And we move on to the next part, the exploiting era. And now, as we explore Sword Fighting Heights Original, by this time in 2014, we can confidently say Sword Fighting Heights Original has become a testing ground for exploits. And you might ask, how does the oldest sword fighting game on Roblox become a testing ground for exploiters? Well, we see the early cheat engines on the game, such as Scene, who dominated the first era of its exploits and destroyed its service of its time. But the second exploiter on this list, by 2014 had become more powerful with his upgraded cheat engines on the game. Not even veterans that invented the travel method on the game could fly away from this. The Cool Kid clan. Cool Kid. Now, it is not verified that it was him. However, rather a group of players that used its early cheat engines amplified testing exploits on Original. But he used one of its early cheat engines on the game, which was called Cool Guy. Cool Kid wasn't the only exploiter that tested its new scripts on this older sword fighting game. Sword Fight on the Heights original had many exploiters dominating and destroying the game by 2014. The Cool Kids clan would join original, destroy the game, removing terrain, change the sky and wars to a red figure, and they would spam join Cool Kid today. Now, by this time, the community was used to it of 2014 and 2016. The regulars never really paid too much attention to the nonsense. We just server hopped to a different server, and nobody really knew Cool Kid would end up becoming really famous, as the community of the Heights would discard him as an annoying pest of the Heights. But the irony is that if Cool Kid who joined the Heights to test his exploits, it would actually make him a veteran of the second era, which is quite ironic. But by 2015, everything changed for the worse. Exploits had become even more deadlier and made the early cheat engines on the game and the cool guy seem nothing. RC7 exploits. Now, RC7 exploits were the most infamous exploits during 2014 to 2017. These exploits essentially purged and wiped out what was left of the old community. As RC exploits were being created by 2014, established by 2015, and leaked by 2016. And you may ask, what was the leak? In 2016, RC7 was one of Roblox's most powerful paid exploits, and it was leaked. What was once limited to a small minority of exploiters suddenly became accessible to many, many more players. This put a purge towards Sword Fight on the Heights Originals community of 2014 to 2016. Players who formed friendships, groups, and battled for years are now defenseless against these exploits. And you may ask, how powerful were these lure scripts? Well, for starters, you could destroy all terrain with B-tools, change maps completely to a different game, God mode and superpowers, inject R18 plus scripts, and wipe out everything within 1 minute. Servers at this point wouldn't even last 2 minutes. That's how powerful these exploits were. To only having a few players with RC7 exploits to 5 of them in a server by 2016. The veterans couldn't do nothing. 2 veterans in this footage, Bunnyface02, who was part of my group in 2014 to 2016 alongside with Catsminer, and another veteran player who I knew for years, Manny150 Dude, who was good friends with Dr. Zap. As seen in this lost footage of them helpless against these RC7 exploits. And this was the case every day during this period. But why did the community stay during this purge? Well, because we all simply knew and respected each other. Half of us didn't even have each other added as friends, but we still stayed because of the love for the game. And now we enter its community. What you're looking at are 50 players I have personally remembered and preserved myself. 50 names, 50 stories, 50 players who kept this era alive. Players who once played every day on this game. Friendships, groups, communities, to now being wiped away through time. These were the last players of the second era, before the game's death took place. Some left completely never to be seen again, or terminated over the years. Others joined communities such as Bridge Sword Fighting or Fencing. Some became legends exceeding Sword Fight on the Heights original. But ladies and gentlemen, this is the preserved player count of 2014 to 2016 of regulars. Now, let's look at some particular players who continued sword fighting after the game's closure. As we know, this game birthed legends, and specifically players in the second era, such as Fats. But Fats wasn't just any ordinary player. He was destined for greatness. Otherwise known as Konomias, who originally started in 2013 and became a veteran of the second era. He was actually one of the very first content creators for Sword Fighting Heights Original on his main account Fats during 2013, which got deleted afterwards. He made Sword Fighting Heights Original his home and represented classical games for years. And when the game closed in 2016, Konomias made many games his home, such as bridge sword fighting and auto duels. He became a duelist, a great duelist at least, with a record of 130-0 in all official duels. He would often only practice on auto duels for hours, for fun. Sometimes he'd be drunk and he'd still perform really well. But then he started making a name for himself as 2018's best sword fighter on Roblox, which blew up. Once Sword Fighting Heights Original closed, I met him on Bridge Sword Fighting, which was my home after the game's closure, where I had the high ground fighting him.
It's over, Anakin! I have the high ground! You underestimate my power! Don't try it!
But nonetheless, all jokes aside, what made Konomias such a great duelist? Well, I've sparred and practiced with him for many years, and one thing I can say, Konomias is a master of adapting to any player's style, advanced baiting, predicting the opponent, and manipulating the opponent's movement. Konomias' style of sword fighting is very effective against any hybrid rushing styles and any offensive style. This was a cup of tea for Konomias. He loved versing players that rushed, which rendered most players, such as myself, as having to adapt and use advanced baiting. And unless you had the high ground or had 50 minutes to duel someone, you could have a chance at it. But count me out, I'm not going to spend 50 minutes to duel someone. But this is how Konomias was about to manage an incredible record of 130-0 between 10 years, which is doable but requires a lot of patience that many don't have. And this is why Konomias is in the official timeline for Sword Fighting Heights Original and the strong representative for the second era. Rumours said during April 2015 that if you wore two particular wings, the gargoyle wings and the webbed wings, that it would increase your speed by double. This was the last glitch of the second era, which was a crazy advantage for its time. But they were only rumours until early 2016, 9 months before the game closed. I saw two players infamously wearing these wings, Toriken and Ishikamama. Both these players wore these wings, and I saw firsthand that they increased the speed of the player. You couldn't touch them. That's how fast they were. And that's when the leader of my group, Catsminer, who led 5 people, including myself, bought the wings and showed us this glitch, and the rumours were true. As I had fought and bought the gargoyle wings, they increased my speed by double. But this didn't just change combat for the older sword fighting game, but for clanning and auto duels as well. We enjoyed it while it lasted, I believe, and nobody understands how this glitch came upon, but it lasted around mid-July 2017. But a sudden shock hit the Sword Fighting Heights original community. Sword Fight on the Heights original closes for the very first time in December 2016. None of us expected it. Many blamed it was because of RC7 exploits, but nobody was certain. And you might ask, what happened afterwards? Well, many players of original were scattered everywhere to different games, such as fencing and bridge sword fighting, which still had an active community. However, my group merged to fencing, where I was still a sword fighter because of bridge sword fighting. But many players quit entirely, half of the community to be exact. By early mid-2017, a Sword Fight on the Heights original player by the name of Blizzardus, who was part of the Golden Era and the Second Era, made the first Sword Fight on the Heights original community group on the game to preserve and collect its veterans. And it worked. Many players joined this community group after the game closed. And sometimes there would be events where all the veterans would play on this now deleted remake on Sword Fight on the Heights original. Blizzardus was a T7 auto dueler and a bridge sword fighter who I was great friends with at the time, as we both had the same idea, which was to revive the game again. And because I was inspired by this, I also established the second Sword Fight on the Heights original group in 2017 to revive the game and bring old and new players alike. But by mid-2017, from a community of 100 regulars on Sword Fight on the Heights original, to now the game closed, roughly around 20 to 30 players left were scattered to different games. Now I remember this day vividly. A good friend of mine for more than a decade, Funny Monkey 7234, who was part of the Second Era as well, told me, "You wouldn't believe it, Sword Fight on the Heights original has been reopened after 2 years of the game closed." I was ecstatic. Finally, the game reopened after so long. But I noticed one thing. Everybody was gone. The game I tried so hard to revive back to its original glory was finally gone. By November 2018, the game had mostly 0 players. And I remember I'd only been playing the game myself. Nobody was here anymore. A lot of the Second Era players got careers, got married, and moved on. I was officially one of the last veteran players of the Golden Era who represented the game. Sword Fight on the Heights original had a broken community, and now the revival takes place in 2019. And that's when the old ways have rejoiced with the new ways. By 2019, the player base would be around 5 to 13 new players on Sword Fight on the Heights original, and a new beginning would form as the old ways are gone and the new ways have started. One thing I did notice, however, was that the swords and platforms broke when the game reopened. Another thing I noticed was, just like RC7 exploits, the game had snips users, which was another form of cheat engines after RC7 got patched in 2017. Players would use snips to exploit and test their script, but some of the new players didn't mind, they stuck through. Some of the new players of the Third Era would include Aero Necro, who played every day as a new regular on the game. Aero Necro was a different type of player that most that I have encountered. He was friendly, talkative, and genuine, who reminded me a lot of the past veterans. But what made Sword Fight on the Heights original players so different to other sword fighting games? It was loyalty. I myself never left original, and I know other players like Vive and Xdash who returned back to original when the game reopened. I never knew Vive or ever spoke to her, but she and many more are part of the history of the game. She quit entirely in 2022, and I never saw her again, but I do wish her well. Her bio says, "To forget," but in this documentary, we remember. As the third era began to take shape, another new face emerged within the original community, CatLolly12. CatLolly12, who was a player that I had seen during the third era of 2019, but I had no recollection of seeing her before 2018 during the second era. However, CatLolly and Erenikru, both being new third era players, gave the game hope and reconciliation. The game was slowly building itself up again, and the numbers grew exponentially by late 2019. And now we move on to early 2020. By the start of 2020, the game had begun rebuilding its community of regular players. Throughout early 2020, seeing 12 to 30 players online each day became the new norm. As the year progressed, the player count continued to grow, eventually reaching over 100 players during the peak periods of late 2020. And that's when I united with Konamias, and we both made a video that blew up together. The two best sword fighters on Roblox during 2020. Now you may ask, why is this important? Well, because with the amount of followers I garnered from that video, I put all the attention towards Sword Fight on the Heights original, whereas Konamias would focus on his dueling videos. And that's when I decided to challenge the record set by Facundo 100, aiming to surpass the legendary milestone of 3,000 KOs in a single sitting. This video quickly gained attention throughout the community, inspiring many other players to attempt the same challenge. As more players returned and new faces arrived, actively on Sword Fight on the Heights original began to grow once again. What started as a single challenge soon became part of a much larger revival. This was also the period when Popper returned and made a successful comeback in 2020.
To everybody that plays this game, I love this game. I will always play this game. Even if I had 5 million subscribers, you're still gonna see me in this server. Even if I had 10 million subscribers, you're still gonna see me in this server. Even if I have 50, you're still gonna see me in this server no matter what, boy. SFOTHO for life, dog.
Now Popper, who was a 2008 player who had become a prominent sword fighter during the golden era and the first era on Sword Fight on the Heights original, who quit entirely in 2013, and years later, coming out of nowhere in 2020, becoming the most famous sword fighter on Roblox by far. It wasn't even close. You would have 40 people queuing on Sword Fight on the Heights original just to be next to him. And for such a small community, he literally conquered it. Popper had an enormous impact on the game, whereas Konamias, myself, and Popper came together in reviving the Sword Fight on the Heights original community. But what made Popper so loved and respected in the community? He was genuine, honest, funny, and a vibrant personality. I had never met someone so genuine and honest in the community myself, and who spoke the truth. It was a breath of fresh air in the community. Popper also would protect the community by exposing toxic players, cheaters, and even pedophiles, because Popper himself knew the community had many young children. He genuinely struck fear into the community for all toxic players and created his own culture for the sword fighting community to follow. Popper and I had actually had a montage together that got taken down at 30,000 views by Shitletsky Studios. But us three became the trio, and with the montages and sword fighting videos combined, Original started to garner 150 to 250 active players again. For the very first time in years, Sword Fighting the Heights Original felt alive again. Much like 2008, it was the beginning of a new era. But the most important fact, however, was Popper was like a mentor to younger people, or even broken people with broken lives. He'd always be there for them. And now, Popper has a few final words he would like to share with the Sword Fighting the Heights original community in this documentary. And now, Popper will speak for the very last time.
This is Popper. This is a pre-recorded message. The date is currently February 22nd, 2022. 2222. You already know it's a special day out here. First thing, I just know that one day SFOTHO is going to make this video, and I can't wait to see it if it ever comes out. But, you know, because he asked me and I love him, he's my brother, I'm going to go ahead and make this audio. So shout out to my brother SFOTHO, you're a real one. Shout out to that boy Konomiya, shout out to that boy S'mores IV, and a shout out to that weird little boy out in Guam named Bomb Antics. That's my dog. But anyways, Sword Fights in the Heights original is my heart, bro. That's childhood memories right there. I remember I couldn't wait in school to go home and play that game. It's crazy how a game that was so simple and bland was so fun, right? It was competitive somehow. Even though, like, nowadays you look at a game like that, it's like, what is there? There's nothing to the game. But what really held that game together was the community. The community was so sick and cool and chill, and you just had a great time. Everybody knew everybody back then, and it was a blast. I'm glad that I had this journey coming back in 2020, and we were able to go ahead and expose all these toxic players, these exploiters, degenerates, pedophiles, all types of these keyboard warriors, right? We took them out one by one, and, you know, you already know those guys sit in their chair, they got their left nutsack hanging off their shorts. You already know that chair stinks, smelling like sweaty ass hair because they've been sitting in that chair for God knows how long, right? Listen, to all you online keyboard weirdos, why don't you turn your computer off, go outside, and touch some motherfucking grass, right? Anyways, listen, one thing I noticed, a lot of kids, they seem like they're addicted to the internet, they can't get off. My best advice, go outside, step out of your comfort zone. If you want to level up as a person, step out of your comfort zone and embrace the uncomfortable, and I promise you will see results as a person. Your internet does not have to be the life. Your internet is not your life, right? Step off the internet. It's a degenerate place. You are miserable, and internet addiction, right, is a symptom. There's something underlying, whether you don't love yourself, you don't respect yourself, whatever it is, you gotta find that issue that's deep inside you, and you gotta transcend that, right? Get off the internet. I promise your life will improve. Seek Jesus Christ. He is the truth, the way, and the life. And shout out to all of the Sword Fights on the Heights original players. I love all of you. Thank you for the journey. Sword Fights on the Heights original will always be a place I'll remember in my heart. And for the very last time, what it do, baby boo? It's your boy Popper, and I'm out.
Sword Fighting the Heights original was booming, and by 2021, the game had reached an incredible 300 to 350 concurrent players, and at one point even surpassed custom duels in player count, something that had never happened before. This was the game's redemption, but it raises one important question. How did Sword Fighting the Heights original come back to life? How?
did a game that averaged just 0 to 5 players in 2018 suddenly grow into a thriving community? Over 300 players in only a few years. The answer was a combination of COVID-19 and content creation. Throughout 2020 and 2021, millions of players around the world were confined to their homes. Older veterans returned out of nostalgia, while an entirely new generation of players discovered Original for the very first time. These two forces came together to create the perfect storm, bringing the game back from the brink and driving it to its biggest resurgence in years. But as we enter 2022, the post-COVID era, I noticed one thing. A lot of the new players got bored and left the game entirely. And you may ask, why did they start leaving? For one, there was no more content creation on the game. Konami's, myself, and Brewpopper, being the three biggest content creators for the time, had quit in 2022 entirely. It was inevitable. Another reason why younger people didn't stick around was because of its simplicity. Nowadays, with the vast majority of technology and advanced stimulating games on the front page, averaging hundreds of thousands of players, Sword Fighter Knights Original had no leverage. New players only joined the game because they associated the idea with old Roblox, and by 2022, the game decreased its reoccurring player count from 300 plus players to only 150. But that 150 were the ones that stayed and formed the last ever community the game had ever had. Two well-known Sword Fighter Knights original players, Jasmine, who is the student of Sophie, an IV player, got together and preserved the community of 2023 to 2026. These are the last players who carried Sword Fighter Knights Original through its final years, 72 players. Together, they created friendships, unforgettable memories, and countless battles during the game's final moments. The last players of the third era, they were simply keeping the spirit of one of Roblox's oldest sword fighting games alive for as long as they could. Eventually, the servers grew quieter, the names became fewer, and another chapter of Sword Fighter Knights Original had come to an end. Just like the first era, the second era, and now the third era, the game's hope for redemption started slowly fading away. But let me take you through how these 72 players played every day to now nobody plays. How can a community of 72 players between 2023 to 2026 become silent and vanish? Let me tell you how. The game always had one problem: exploits, and how they evolved over the years with its early cheat engines, RC7 exploits, and synapse. By 2023, the game had around 50 to 100 players, but progressively kept decreasing as time went on. Many of the player base left to MSF, or Sword Fight for Time, and by this time, it was an unstable community. Exploiters that would play Sword Fighter Knights Original would make a program of a bot to where they continuously loop kill all servers. The modern day exploiters got worse. At least with RC7 exploits and the earliest cheat engines on the game, you could server hop, and many exploiters back then wouldn't loop kill, they would chill. There was still honor in the community. But in recent years, exploiters had decreased more in value. That's when Jasmine, who loved the game, played every day, would say, "I'm not dealing with this," and she moved on to other sword fighting games. By 2024,
Sword Fight on the Heights Original's player count had fallen to just 20 to 50 active players, marking a dramatic decline from the game's former glory. But it wasn't all bad. Throughout those final years, the community grew closer than ever. Friendships were formed, rivalries became legendary, and respect between players became a defining part of the experience. Many players formed their own groups and circles. If you attacked or defeated a member of one of those groups, you'd often find yourself making enemies with the rest of time. A player that caught my eye, however, was Xdash, a second era player and a third era player who I grew up with. Xdash was one of the only veterans in the second era who witnessed all of the third era. I didn't even partake in the third era. But nonetheless, what are some of the events that happened on Original? A marriage. No, literally, a wedding took place on the oldest sword fighting game on Roblox, and I wasn't invited. And by 2025 to 2026, everybody was gone. For the very last time. The loop-killing exploiters that created bots would force many to astray. The only way this game could be redeemed one day is an update, and the odds are very low as many have tried pursuing that idea, including myself. The last testimony of the neighbouring player, Corbin368, who is a second era, third era, and a golden era player who created many challenges for the Sword Fight on the Heights community. Corbin would often give out massive prizes and rewards with the competition. He was the last content creator that represented IV and Original in 2025 to 2026, and now he wants to personally say a few things.
Thank you for the introduction, SFOTHO. First off, I feel like I need to acknowledge SFOTHO for putting this entire documentary together. I mean, come on now. If you've made it this far in the video, I don't know how far we are, we're probably about an hour in. I think you can agree with me that this is truly a work of art that SFOTHO put together. So SFOTHO, I truly admire your passion for this project and all of the dedication and research that you put into it, along with anybody else that was involved. Thank you for giving me an opportunity to share my short testimony. Even though most of my sword fighting experience on Roblox has been through Sword Fight on the Heights 4, Sword Fight on the Heights Original, however, was one of the very first games that I ever played, and the first game to introduce me to sword fighting as a whole. While both of these games have very different mechanics and play styles, I never looked at them as two separate communities, if that makes sense. To me, Sword Fight on the Heights 4 and Sword Fight on the Heights Original is one community. Players constantly moved between both of the games. I would always recognize familiar names no matter which version of the game that I was playing. The communities just overlapped far more than I think people realize, and that's because Original is where it all began. And just looking back, it's kind of amazing that a game built around such a simple idea could create such a passionate community. Sword Fight on the Heights Original is not filled with complicated objectives like you see with new Roblox games today. It doesn't have hundreds of features. It's literally just players, swords, and a small map. And yet somehow that simplicity created rivalries, friendships, and unforgettable moments. It really is the people that make Sword Fight on the Heights Original so special. And I think this documentary that SFOTHO put together is perfect proof of that. So to every player who helped shape each era of Sword Fight on the Heights Original, thank you for making the community what it is today. And finally, to SFOTHO, thank you for preserving this piece of Roblox history. That's all I have to say.
Anyways guys, this is the end of the video. Thanks to everybody that was watching, those who are in the community, or perhaps you never knew a simple game like the oldest sword fighting game had complete lore to it. I did this video in honor of the people before me, with me, and after me, all generations on this game. However, I also want to thank everybody such as Catsminer, Aquera, and all the friends that I made during this time.
I remember playing on my Windows XP 2002 computer, and I just remember the lag, I remember the people complaining about hacks, I remember all the groups, I remember all the funnage people had. It was also the best experience of my life, and it carries on to my adult life as well, as you guys are all grown up now. You know, you guys are no longer kids, and I'm not going to be there anymore to see you guys grow up even more. But thank you everybody for watching. Goodbye.